Welcome back to the Bible in Context,
where context is king and the original author's intent drives our interpretation.
Yes, and this time we're finally, well, actually, we've already been in chapter 35, halfway through it.
So. Yeah, that's where we left off last time, with Rebekah's nurse dies. She gets mentioned, but Rebekah never does.
Yeah, Rebekah gets written out of the story for her all of her deception and her trying to enact an exodus she could never do.
Right.
And chapter 35, we talked about how we finally wrapped up Jacob's exodus here. He made a mistake by not going to Bethel. He went to Shechem instead, and so he's finally going back to fulfill his vow. And it made me think, as I was thinking about this throughout the week, I wonder if the reason that the Jacob story is so upside down compared to the other patriarchs is because he is the one that gets named Israel. And so, Abraham, he's this model of, even though imperfect, he's still a model of faith. And Jacob is a model of doing everything wrong. And that's kind of the biblical story as you go throughout Samuel and Kings and so on. Like, they are a model of having God's covenant and then doing everything wrong. Right.
Yeah, Jacob, his name from the very beginning just kind of sets the tone for the rest of the story of the Israelites.
So it just makes me wonder if, the author, he can pick which details he uses for his stories. He's trying to display God's character and humanity's character. Like he could have told us very little about Jacob, just like he did with Isaac, and just went on with the story. But perhaps, and just thinking perhaps, maybe he took Jacob and showed him as such a twisted character because he gets renamed Israel, so that Israel, as they're reading this, they can't not see themselves in this backwards character. Right. And so the author's sitting there nudging them, like, that's you. Don't be like him, because that is you.
Right. Well, and I think it's meant to also just highlight God's faithfulness and showing over and over, even though his chosen people have acted foolishly and deceptively, he continues to keep his promises.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, we see that throughout Jacob's story, since at every turn he's trying to weasel his way in or out of something, and God's taking care of him. All right, so we finally wrapped this story up. He's finally finished out that exodus. He fulfilled his vow. He came back, made the sacrifices, communed with God, and we had some genealogies, some notes of death and things, just to kind of wrap that up and for the author to signal to us, like, hey, this is the end of this story. It's a new part of the story. So we're now halfway through chapter 35 and verse 16, and there's a few interesting things to talk about here. I've mentioned before on other parts of the podcast that this is the most confusing section of Genesis to me. It's just, as in, how does this factor into the rest of the story? How does it factor into the rest of Scripture? What are the interbiblical links here? Especially just with Migdal Eder, and we'll get to that, but this part perplexes me a little bit. So, all right, after leaving, they journeyed from Bethel in verse 16, and they were some distance from Ephrath, which is near Bethlehem, and Rachel went into labor, and she had a hard labor, and then she has another son. And then as she was dying, she's dying from childbirth here, and she calls his name Ben-Oni, which could mean either son of my strength or son of my sorrow. Scholars really aren't sure which direction to take that ultimately, and it makes sense either way in the story.
Well, and we've already seen a pattern of names having double meanings. And so I think this is probably maybe one of those examples of a name that has another double meaning.
That could be the case. Yeah, I mean, obviously this baby sapped her of her strength and also is a reason for sorrow. She's dying. So yeah, that could be what's going on there. Maybe both are intended. And anyway, that's obviously a negative name. And so Jacob, he comes and kind of denies this dying wish of his wife and renames him Benjamin, which is, instead of son of my sorrow or son of my strength, son of my right hand or son of my fortune. So either way, the first name is not a good one, and either way you take it, the second name is a good one. So there's a few things going on here with this renaming. First of all, where have we typically seen renamings so far throughout Genesis? What does it signify to us?
Well, it's usually God who's doing the renaming, and it's usually in the context of a blessing.
Yeah, and it's in the context of recreation.
Oh, yeah,
or creation, often throughout the Exodus cycles. And so there's not really an exodus going on here, but we still have this element of new creation going on. So yeah, I mean, the last renaming we've seen was Jacob going from Jacob to Israel, and that was part of an exodus experience that he was going through, and part of his recreation and his being set aside for another purpose as a nation of Israel. And here we have Benjamin, or Ben-Oni, being his function is being reassigned essentially by his dad renaming him. He goes from a son of sorrow, or a son of taking his mother's strength, to a son of his right hand, or a son of fortune. And so, first of all, we kind of have a recreation motif going on here, and then there's also the fact that he's elevating his son. It sounds like if he's going to be the son of the right hand, which that's kind of leadership language in the Bible, it sounds like he is elevating him to the place of firstborn. He's expecting this to be the firstborn son, and he also, you could take it again as son of fortune, but I think the same connotations are live there. And so Benjamin, it sounds like we're expecting him to be the firstborn son, and that's going to be significant later in the story. This is actually a part of the story that does seem to make sense as you read through Joseph's story and his test of his brothers in Egypt, but we'll get there. But anyway, we just need to know that as we're going forward, we're expecting Benjamin to be the firstborn son, because Jacob has not only renamed him, but also given him an elevated renaming. Now, going on in verse 19, Rachel has died. She was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. Jacob set up a pillar over her tomb, and we've seen a few pillars throughout this story. You mentioned this, I think, a week or two ago. It is interesting that we only have the pillar being set up as Jacob is leaving Canaan and going to Laban. As he meets God, he sets up a pillar in Bethel and anoints it to be the place of God's house. We see that in chapter 28, verse 18 and verse 22. Then the word pillar again shows up in chapters 31 4 times. Some of those are referring back to the pillar in chapter 28. It's God reminding him of his vow. And then there's also a couple of occurrences that are talking about the pillar that Jacob and Laban set up in order to ratify their covenant with one another, that backwards covenant that we talked about before. And then also again in chapter 35, we have it here where he sets up the pillar that he talked about, bringing into that story, and then bringing into that tension of like that vow needing to be created, putting a cap on the story in a way, following through this pillar trope. And then again another pillar over Rachel's tomb. And I kind of wonder if that's just supposed to be like another, following this pillar pattern throughout the story. It's supposed to be, again, a nice cap on Jacob's story as we're coming to the end of his story. But it is also interesting that we have pillar language that's supposed to be about God's house, and then pillar language about the vow with Laban, pillar applied to God's house again, and then pillar applied to Rachel. I wonder if that back and forth is significant. I really don't know what is going on, because it's not like the pillar shows up just in specific special places that are all linked by certain words that I can tell right now. But it just may be, again, to highlight a place of importance and kind of an ending to Jacob's story. And so after she's gone, she's out of the story now, we have the death of another matriarch. So again, we're winding down in the story, getting to the closing action. And in verse 21, it says, Israel, that is Jacob, journeyed on and pitched his tent beyond the tower of Eder. Now this in Hebrew is Migdal Eder, which is also translated the tower of the flock. And something that is a little bit frustrating about this is that, at least in the ESV, let me pull it up here, in Micah 4, in Genesis we saw that it's translated the Tower of Eder, whereas in Micah 4:8, this same phrase, Migdal Eder, is translated the Tower of the Flock. And so you lose the connection. There's a connection here because Migdal Eder is only mentioned in Micah 4:8 and in Genesis 35, where we're looking at here.
What's the context of Micah 4:8?
Yeah, so Micah 4 and into chapter 5 is looking at the coming Redeemer, pointing forward to the one that's going to come from Bethlehem, and meanwhile Israel is sort of in birth pangs, actually. And so there's actually a scholar, Gary Schnittier, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he wrote a book called The Old Testament Use of the Old Testament, and he has, it's great resource, so I'd suggest that one. It's a really good book. It's more of a reference book of just seeing where he has seen over many years of study where the Bible is connected to other places in the Bible, at least in the Old Testament. And he has an article here on Micah 4 to chapter 5, and he talks about the links between Genesis 35 and Micah 4, at least with the mention of Migdal Eder, and also how it contains birth pain and Bethlehem, all wrapped up there in one, and the birth of a son and a coming king. And so it's difficult because there's not really enough in the passages to say, like, hey, there is a clear, Micah is clearly carrying forward the meaning in a way that has a clear interpretation. It may be that Micah is taking the imagery and the plot of Genesis 35 and bringing it forward as kind of a backdrop to his message in Micah 4 to 5, but we're really not sure. There's not enough there to say, hey, this is definitely the origin of the promise that the Messiah is going to come from Bethlehem. That seems to be what would be the thrust between Genesis 35 and Micah, but I don't see it there, and Schnittier in his book, he doesn't go so far to say that's what's going on, because I don't think he can see it either. He's not able to pin it down and say, hey, with a good methodology, Micah is definitely looking at chapter 35 of Genesis and saying this is the origin of the promise of the Messiah from Bethlehem. So
yeah, it seems like I wonder if that kind of parenthetical phrase is added here, talking about Ephrath, just to make that connection to Bethlehem, because Bethlehem becomes a significant city in David's life.
Right. And I mean, we should do an episode on prophecy sometime.
Right.
But, I think that promise in Micah isn't necessarily saying, and I need to do some further study on this, but I don't think it's necessarily saying that the Messiah has to come from Bethlehem. I think what Micah is saying is this is going to be a new David. He's coming from the city of David.
Right.
And so, yes, it does end up that providentially, or the gospel authors, they capitalize on the fact that Jesus is from Bethlehem, and it seems like some interpreters of their day are saying this is supposed to be taken literally. And that's worth noting, is that the gospel accounts don't say Jesus is supposed to come from Bethlehem. It says that some scribes think that he's supposed to come from Bethlehem.
Right.
So,
right. And this is the first time that Bethlehem is mentioned in the Bible. But it seems like, it's in there just as a parenthetical statement to say, hey, this will give you a hyperlink.
Right. And I think you do get the expectation of a Bethlehem origin of the Messiah, or even the Messianic line, starting with David there. But I can't figure out how to draw the links back to Genesis 35. Right. The closest thing I can find is Ruth. Because in Ruth 4:11, this is after they're ratifying the marriage and the redemption of Boaz with Ruth. And it says, "We are witnesses, may Yahweh make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and like Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrath and be renowned in Bethlehem. May your house be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." And so this book is leading up to the birth of David, and it talks about, may you have a name of renown from Bethlehem. So I think this is where we start to get the idea that, okay, Bethlehem and Ephrath are going to be these cities that have connotations of kingly origin. This is where we begin to have that expectation that the Messiah is going to come from this place, or at least have family origins in this place. But as far as Genesis 35 goes, I don't think we get explicit expectations from this. But it also just seems to me that Micah is drawing on this. I don't know if he's just using this passage as a backdrop to what he's trying to say, or if there's some further link that I and other scholars that have looked at this aren't really picking up on yet. So maybe one day I'll have a final answer and definitively say yes or no, there's something going on here. But it seems just suspicious to me that, again, we have the imagery of birth pains, of Migdal Eder, Bethlehem, in both Micah and here. And also there's this very significant son born in this context. And so, is there something significant about Benjamin's recreation motif here happening alongside this particular place? I don't know. I would really like to find out and say yes, but I don't know.
Or maybe it's just a hint that he's going to play a significant role later on in the story.
Maybe. maybe if there was some sort of, again, this would get into the dating of all the books and make kind of a mess of it, so I don't know if we should go here, but if there were already some kind of like expectations about Bethlehem back in the day before this was all written, I wonder if the original readers would say, oh, Benjamin's born from Bethlehem, like this, he's really getting some good connotations here, like he's looking kind of like the firstborn son, he's looking messianic, what's going on? I thought the king came from Judah, I don't know, that's a possibility too. But that also starts messing with like when books dated, that becomes important. And
right. Is there any significance like the role that he plays even in the story of Joseph?
There will be.
Yeah,
there will be.
I'm just wondering if this is his name as a foreshadowing of what happens there at all. I don't know.
Well, it is significant. I think this part of the story is definitely trying to build Benjamin up. To make you expect that he's going to be the firstborn,
right?
And then we find out that he's not. But that's what this is supposed to do. I don't know what role Bethlehem plays here. If it's supposed to push forward expectations of a king from Bethlehem, or if it's supposed to be part of the background that reinforces Benjamin's firstborn expectation.
Right.
I guess that's where I'm at now.
Yeah. Well, and it almost seems like the story is designed in such a way that, okay, he's got 12 sons, and you're almost left kind of guessing, okay, who's going to be the promised offspring, the seed of the woman to carry on the promises of God and the covenant promises. And, like, is it going to be the firstborn? Is it going to be Reuben? And then him and, he's going to mess up here soon. And then, is it going to be Levi or Simeon? Well, they have already messed up. And it's kind of, maybe it'll be Joseph, because, he goes through, and it's not even him.
Right.
And so it kind of goes back and forth, and you're wondering, okay, who's it going to be? Who's it going to be? And you don't even really, like, you get some hints by the end of Genesis, but you really don't know.
Yeah, well, you have a certain expectation for one of them, but there's actually a current firstborn, and then a later firstborn that's promised. And so there's even some mix and match in Genesis. But, you're right. By the time you get through Genesis, you've had, within Jacob's 12 sons, you've got, Reuben, Levi, Simeon, next in line is Judah. You've also had Joseph and Benjamin. So at least 5 candidates for firstborn son in this story. So I think he's trying to throw you off and create some tension in the story with the firstborn status.
Yeah, I'm wondering, like, if you were a first reader of Genesis, would you have any kind of expectation that it was Judah? You might. There's some hints, but I don't know.
Yeah, well, and that's just, again, there's debate on, was this written during the exile? Was it pre-exilic? And so that just brings you back to those debates. And I don't know, what were the expectations of the people who were the actual original readers?
Right.
Some people think that, Moses actually wrote all or most of this. I don't quite think that's correct. We can talk about that another day.
Yeah, that's a whole other podcast.
We should do an episode on the canon, though, at some point. How we got the Bible that we have.
Right. That would be really good.
All right. Yeah, so moving on here. So Rachel has just passed away. We've got Benjamin now. Some really confusing stuff going on here with Ephrath and Benjamin. And so he goes on and pitches his tent beyond the Tower of Eder. And it says in verse 22, while Israel lived in that land, Reuben went in and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. So this is exactly what you were just saying. He's just disqualified himself. And let's talk for a second. We talked about this before on the podcast, but why did he do that?
It was a power grab, wasn't it?
Yeah. And we've already seen this with Ham. If you go back and listen to the chapter or the episode on Ham and what he did, we talk about how he tried to do that as a power grab. Reuben, he is this character throughout his story that is trying to get power and can't seem to be a good leader. So this is his next method to do it. We see, I think it's Absalom, do it as well in 2 Samuel 16. He takes all of his father's concubines and sleeps with them on the roof of the palace in front of all Israel so that they can see. He has taken the matriarchs, and so therefore he is now the power head of the royal family. In this culture and throughout the Bible as kind of just a pattern, we see people who are taking their father's wives in order to say, hey, we are now the dominant character of the family. So Reuben is he's kind of having a last-ditch effort at power here, and it disqualifies him. He makes some more efforts actually in the future to try to restore himself. We'll see that once we get to chapter 37, but for now that's what's going on here. This isn't just like a weird one-off story. This is part of a larger pattern of sons trying to take the firstborn status, which they do with other means all over.
It's a little bit ironic since Reuben is the firstborn.
Right.
But evidently he didn't. He recognized in some way, shape, or form that Jacob didn't look at him, probably because he's Leah's firstborn.
Probably, actually.
And so he probably, he's grown up with his mom feeling overlooked and oppressed. And so he's trying to do a power grab because he feels like he is the rightful firstborn. He feels like this is who I should be. And you're denying me, and so I'm going to just take it for myself.
Right. Yeah, we're going to see him doing that same exact thing later in the story. So that's exactly what he's trying to do here, I think. And I think that's significant that you brought up that he's not Rachel's son, so he probably needs something to give him a leg up on the firstborn status.
Right. Well, and we've seen already Jacob's apathy towards Leah's kids. Even Dinah, he says nothing when she's defiled.
Yeah, that's true.
And is just completely apathetic. In fact, the only reason he's even upset at the end of the last chapter he's not upset about the defilement of Dinah. He's not even upset really about how Dinah's other son, Simeon and Levi, went and just ravaged this whole city. He's worried about himself and how they've made him look bad.
Right. Even when he turned a corner there after wrestling with God, he used basically the servants and Leah and all their children as fodder for Esau's army so that Rachel and Benjamin could get away. Or Rachel and Joseph, sorry.
Right, yeah.
He's just, you're right. He doesn't seem to have that much care throughout the story for Leah and the servants' children.
Right. And so I can put myself in Reuben's shoes a little bit and understand at least why he's trying to make this power grab.
Yeah, he needs something to get into the firstborn role because he's probably not going to get it by himself.
Right.
So we wrap up this story and we get to, in verse 22 on down to verse 26, we have a genealogy of Jacob's children. So again, that's a real nice marker to say, hey, this story is over. We're entering into a new narrative section. That's what genealogies are doing throughout the book of Genesis.
Yep.
As well as catching us up on okay, who's the key players in the next story, and just helping us know the family history.
Right. Well, and I think it's interesting in that genealogy, it even mentions Reuben as Jacob's firstborn.
Yeah. Yeah, actually.
The irony I think we're supposed to see there.
Right. And so, and this may be one where maybe the word's being used a little more literally as the actual firstborn, or it could be that he was actually serving in the function of firstborn at the time and trying to even one up his father through what he did in verse 22.
Right.
But moving on, they in verse 27, Jacob comes to his father Isaac at Mamre, and Isaac dies at 180 years. So another good old age, a good closing for Isaac's story.
Well, when we see that phrase again, and he was gathered to his people, you get this sense that there was this expectation that one day he would be able to see them again, expectation of resurrection.
Yeah. And also just old and full of days, and so there's kind of idea of blessed by God. He had a good life,
right.
And God blessed the longevity of his life. And it says that his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. So again, just kind of a good note we end the story on of they're kind of reconciled and doing something together again, even after he deceived Esau again by not meeting him in Seir.
Yeah, it's interesting. You get the last story of Esau. You really get this picture of he ends up being a good guy.
Yeah,
and he's a forgiving brother. He lets go of the anger that he had towards Jacob.
Yeah, he definitely does. And we're actually about to get into his genealogy next, and we'll see that kind of the mixture, the good and bad of his character and why it's significant. So, all right, we'll pick up with the genealogy next time, and that was actually going to be good. So we're not just going to, again, genealogies are not dry lists of names. They're significant, and there's all kinds of stuff sprinkled throughout this one. So definitely check that one out to understand what's going on in chapter 36. Don't throw out that whole chapter. All right, we'll talk about that next time.
All right.